Good morning. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this very special event that we are organizing at the Library of Alexandria. My name is Ismail Saragildin. I'm the director of the Library of Alexandria, and I'm also the co-chair of the Nizami Ganjavi International Center, who, with the Club de Madrid, have been kind enough to collaborate with the Library of Alexandria in organizing this event. May I first and foremost welcome all our very, very distinguished guests who are on this program, heads of state and government who will be sharing their experience and their wisdom with us. Yesterday, while some of the people arrived early, we chatted, and there was a question about some aspects of this conference. So I thought that before turning the floor over to our distinguished immediate panel to welcome you, I will just explain what this conference is and what it is not. So to start with, this is a prologue. I'll just show you 5 slides here. What this conference is about. Can we improve over current models of democracy? We are not rejecting democracy. We are not saying that dictatorship or fascism or communism or Nazism or any of the isms is better than democracy. But we are saying that the models that we have seen in various democratic countries have also gotten some problems. And can we think about what we can do that is better? What is it? We desire certain outcomes: freedom, justice, equality, social choice, participation, due process, rule of law, the right of dissent, pluralism, protection of minorities, transparency, accountability. All of these are desirable outcomes. The question is, we have believed for a long time that democracy will deliver these outcomes. A democratic system, as conventionally defined, was supposed to deliver all these outcomes. Yet we find that many of the practitioners of democracy in countries where democracy has been well established, like in the United States and Western Europe, are having disenchantment with some of these aspects. Everything from money and corruption, entering into the political process, et cetera, other kinds of problems. So the question is, can we find ways to improve over what we have inherited and see more? What are these problems? Well, the alienation of the citizens. They find frequently that the governments they possess are not necessarily representative of their views. They find that governments are ineffective. When deadlock, for example, twice closed down the federal government of the United States, when Belgium requires 521 days and is still unable to agree on a prime minister in parliament, questions arise about effectiveness. It's reflected in low participation rates in voting, low membership in parties, in political parties, the constant concern with money and corruption in the electoral process, and the point of self-perpetuating politicians who stay in power too long. So the question is, do we have any new ideas? And so with the combination of scholars and practitioners that we have in this hall, and the smattering of younger people, we hope that we will be able to think primarily. And this is one of my favorite quotations from President John F. Kennedy, who says, "The enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to a prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought." We want a little bit of discomfort here. We want everybody to spend time thinking. So what are the background questions for this conference? Here they are. Are the current modes of operation of democratic systems delivering these desired outcomes? Are we confusing means with results, like means like elections, with results which are the desired outcomes that we've just listed? Are there new instruments that we could incorporate into our democratic models that will bring us closer to these desired outcomes? So these are the questions that we hope to answer. I hope we will discuss them freely and openly and let our imaginations soar. So that's just a prologue to this conference, which I hope you will keep at the back of your mind. We are not trying to do away with democracy. We want to improve it, improve the practice of it anyway, and see whether or not we can, in fact, do better than what we have. So with that, you can bring us back our nice flags. Yes, that's better, thank you. I'm very happy to introduce the speakers in this first session. Speaking on behalf of the Library of Alexandria is Dr. Adher al-Biltagi, who is the chair of the executive committee of the Library of Alexandria. He represents His Excellency the President of Egypt, who is the chair of the board in the absence of the president himself. So our first speaker will be Dr. Adher al-Biltagi on behalf of the Library of Alexandria. Dr. Adher, please go ahead. Thank you.
Good morning. Excellencies, honorable participants, ladies and gentlemen. The title of the basic elements which I'm going to speak about, which I put, is democracy between perception and deception. The world is facing a turbulent time with an ever-increasing rate of change. Socio-political upheavals coupled with geopolitical conflicts in tandem with global threats of climate change necessitate a shift of modalities and codes of conduct to establish a new world order based on peace and prosperity for the citizens of this planet. Democracy, as we all know, is a tool for creating a better world for all people around the world. It means to express the will of the people and to draw the way for them to realize their hopes and dreams. The basic concept of democracy should cut across boundaries. And these boundaries start from the individual to the family, to the communities, to nations, and to regions, and then to the globe and the whole world. Education and knowledge are central to the democratic process. A populace that is poorly informed is likely to be manipulated and exploited, and the world has seen this repeatedly. The gap between the perceived principal concepts of democracy and the actual reality is widening and is reflected in different forms and shapes of pseudo-democracy. While respecting diversities is a basic value of democracy, we face the threat of increasing tension within and between societies and nations. Among the countries that are considered democratic, there is a threat of a movement of anti-multiculturalism mixed with prejudice and or racism. In order to reach balance, the world needs a new perception of its common history. No country or region in the world can claim the ownership of the history of civilization. The dynamic shifts of centers which radiate knowledge has emanated from different regions and parts of the world, starting from Egypt and other ancient civilizations, bringing about a universal awareness of our oneness is essential for democracy. That's why democracy has to be between equal. If you don't have a sense of oneness, there is no equality. And if there is no equality, there is no democracy. If we emphasize separateness, isolation, and discrimination within national and global communities, the whole world will suffer. The plague which we face takes different forms, such as terrorism, prejudice, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, greed, hegemony, and moral superiority. This causes a rupture in the moral fabric of humanity, which hinders the realization of true democracy, stability, and harmony between nations. On the global level, the United Nations emerged to respond to the threats which the world has faced after 2 world wars. It is time now to reconsider its bylaws and restructure it to respond to the present needs. Without such a serious restructuring, it will become increasingly difficult for the United Nations to fulfill its mandate of maintaining global peace and order. When it comes to issues that are essential for the survival of our species and our planet, our record is far from being impressive. Many summits where vital issues were addressed, starting from Rio in 1992 to 20 years after, Johannesburg and 10 years after, the Food Summit and 5 years after. This is a repeat for summit meetings because we don't fulfill what we say that we will fulfill. Kyoto summits and different G8 and G20 and other at the international and regional level has produced resolutions that have, for the most part, not translated to action. If I talk about issues, which is lately we had in Paris the meeting for the climate change, but before that, several meetings. In Copenhagen, I was there. We called this meeting in Copenhagen for climate change, Hopenhagen. There was great hope that we can establish a knowledge hub to disseminate knowledge to the countries which will be victimized by the increase of temperature, and another fund for the countries of the South. And this decision was there, nothing happened. We moved to Cancun, and in Cancun we had a very interesting motto. You say, in Cancun, yes, we can. I think the ambassador of Mexico is here. And in Cancun, we met again, we repeat the whole thing, and nothing happened. And then after this, 2 other meetings, and the meeting in Paris with great hopes was held only in the last 10 or 12 days. But in this last summit of the climate change in Paris, indications for changes and shifts of position to face a common threat of the global warming have been noted. For example, President Hollande of France has called for cooperation and collaboration rather than competition, and equity between North and South for a better future for all. This is a trend which we hope it will continue, a trend of feeling that we are all one, that if we are really heading for the basic honorable principle of democracy, then we have to maintain this on a global level. Our responsibility should come out. This is a responsibility for the individual, for nations, for scholars, as well as collectively. It has to show up in our organization, which we built up from time to time to organize peace and order. The old library of Alexandria was a center of dissemination of knowledge and a platform for scholars to examine the veracity and utility of such knowledge, a task which is highly needed now as it was in the time of its inception. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable participants, We are gathered now in the new library to focus our effort on examining the broader meaning of democracy, its instrument, and applications across many levels. We are looking forward for the outcome of your deliberation and discussion to shed light on the way forward. I do thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adel Biltagi. Thank you, Dr. Adel Biltagi, for these kind words on behalf of the Library of Alexandria, the Board of Trustees of the Library of Alexandria, of whom many members are present in the audience, and I salute many of their excellencies, various members of the board. May I now move on to Her Excellency Ambassador Fatma Zahra, member of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Ismail Sirajuddin, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for Mr. Sirajuddin for inviting me to participate in this conference that is centered on the 21st century democracy. And one more time, we would like to confirm it is not a library, it is just a beacon for civilization and for everyone who wants to inhale from its cultural ideas in all aspects and with its creativity. So all along the history, it is there were always the problem of controversy and controversial subject of being between of the relation between the rulers and the citizens, and then we had the contract that we had for the relation between the ruler and the citizens of the country that will result at the end in stability. And if I wanted to have in this intervention the Western democracy, one of the important things that or the crisis that we are having is will create, and discussing them will allow maybe the democracy to understand the changes of the 21st century. The 20th century has ended, and we have discovered that the democratic system of the Western community or the West is the best for the aspiration of different countries, and this is for the peaceful transition of power, and it believes in pluralism and awareness, high awareness and protection of freedom and the rights, the human rights, and we have the lots of problems that we have faced, and we have a deficit in democracy, and this is what we have. And what happens in the West, I think that the citizen disbelieve nowadays in the success of this democracy. And from the beginning of democracy in Athens, it was always a matter or a subject of controversy in this period of time. And but still, the democracy is deeply rooted in the heart of the people all along history, and then it emerges. And when we talk about Sparta and actually when we talk about also Nietzsche and the prince and the idea of control, and I don't want to go into this subject that much because if we talk about the French philosophers for actually having this kind of contract that will be the driving force of democracy of those founders, and which is all goes back to Europe. And in Europe, we started to have this enlightening kind of democracy, especially after the French Revolution, that ended that was faced really by the royal system. And the 20th century actually witnessed, after 2 wars, the collapse of these dictatorships and one after the other, and the other non-democratic systems, some of them are just having forged democracy. And what happens? We can divide it to three different groups. The first one is talking about the financial and economical policies that have hindrances from time to another, like what we have seen, the crisis, the recession that we have had, and the inflation at the beginning of the 70s. And if we can recall this, the studies that we have had on the level of the philosopher humbleness, and he talked about the problem of the continuity of the capitalism and its influence on the democracy, and that it will actually cause problems to democracy. And then Karl Marx talked about also what is after democracy, when he asked who has the right to rule in a capital or in a country that counts on capitalism. And we have bit by bit, what happens is that we have for the multinational companies and for the markets and the central banks. And if we will look into the Petrity, that will talk about the inequity in the Western world, when he had his study that included like 23 different countries on the continuity and what happens in the last 3 centuries, and he reached a conclusion that he saw in it that what is possible to happen is that one day we will be able to have, or that what will happen is that people will control the wealth and the powers at the same time, that will have an oligarchian society that will control democracy. And these are the points briefly that I want to talk about, the ideas of the policies that are related to economy. Some people believe, or there is another group that feels that there are hindrances in the inclusion in the challenges and that we have problems in this 21st century, and let's say in Greece, and the crisis, the financial crisis that they had, and how it is seen by the normal citizen. Actually, there was a conflict between the will of the national will that came with the government, with the sweeping majority, and the will of an over-national actually power, which is the European Union, that started to have their own ideas about how to control and have the rule. And the people refused, according to end this by a referendum that they have had with the sweeping majority, and they were able. At the end, they agreed to have this inclusion with the European Union, and it's shown in the Greek crisis that there was a gap in the democracy process. And what happens is that some of the technocrats that weren't chosen by the people or by the citizens were able to control their destiny. And I think, and I recall, and I would like to mention as well, usage of the euro as an alternative kind of currency in some of the countries of the European Union. We didn't talk about the establishment and the changes in the European society, and in two countries, in Sweden and in Denmark, according to the referendum that they had, they didn't want to be included in it. And there is another thing, something that a phenomena, which is have micro powers that are imposing themselves on the political arena, new political arena, in a way that causes impact, which is which are the NGOs, and that they and with the revolution of communication, the NGOs at the end were able to have a larger and wider scope, which what allowed them to actually disseminate, and they have become much more powerful to be able to convey the requirements and aspirations of citizens for their legal rights or the classical rights. And also, there is a group of reasons that are related with the having like mega powers, like China, like the Asiatic countries. And China, we can say that it's a unique, actually, experiment or experience that was able to break the legend of the monopoly and control of the world. And they were able to control the area of the Arab world. And then we can say that China was able to deal with issues that used to take decades in the Western society, like let's say the pension. And in 2 years, China was able to provide extra pensions for 240 million person, and this is what is equal to the pensions there in the United States, or the number of people who are there in the United States, very close to it. And there are things that happened foreign politics. For instance, like the invasion of Iraq, which was to the Western actually citizen. They understood the main reasons for this invasion. And this wasn't for the mass destruction weapons and dissemination of freedom, but it was just for control that showed up clearly. And actually it affected the models, the democratic models, in a very bad and negative effect. And we get out of this because of this presentation. If we want to say, and we have to say that there are crises that are facing democracy in the West, and it is the problem of the practices and the leaders. It is not the problem of values and models. So the question is there is a perception for these crises or not? Is there? And the other question, is there any great will for actually change? And what about the philosophy of rule for 2,000 years? And if they started the democracy since the beginning of the 17th century, and if there is now a democratic fatigue, as we call it, in the 21st century, are there places where we can have creative democracy models that will be able to take all the challenges and the changes of the 21st century? And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Fatma Zahra. And now I would like to call on His Excellency Ambassador Ahmed Ben Helli, representative of the League of Arab States, for we are, of course, not only members of the League of Arab States, but our entire region right now is in a period of turmoil. And since the people of many parts of the region launched what we refer to as the Arab Spring, there has been an ongoing and unquenchable desire for more democratic systems. And I think it is important that we hear from His Excellency Ahmed Ben Helli. Please, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Ismail Sirajuddin, Director of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, ladies and gentlemen of the audience. The question that was asked in this session, why are we here?
Why are we here?
Why are we here? My paper here is we want to talk about democracy in the 21st century. And I will take a shortcut and say that I will speak personally. In my capacity here, I will talk about the emerging democratic experience in the Arab world. And I will try to answer three questions, or to address three questions. Are the strong winds of change that has blown over this region at the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011 is the natural result of the evolution in the Arab world, or is it deliberate and it is perpetrated by some people? And are there bases for these uprisings that took place in the Arab region? And the third question is, what are the challenges that were brought about by this new state that and were put before the Arab region as represented by the Arab League? I want to say that the winds of change that have swept over the region is a natural end result of social interaction and the reality of Arab nations to evolve, to cope with the world around it, and to cope with the time and the requirements of Arab nations. We do not live in isolation. We are part of this world, and I might say also in the heart of this world, and so we should never be on the margin. And such uprisings were led by youth, Arab youth, who are aware and well-informed about communication technologies and their concerns for their futures and the future of their nations. Okay. Are there foreign perpetrators for this? Of course there are agendas. No doubt about that. And you know about research centers, and you're the best people to talk about this chaos, creative chaos, remapping the Arab region. All these interventions are there, but these uprisings at times have taken a downward spiral from political demands to militarization of the peaceful process in some countries, and in other countries has the fruits of such uprisings were harvested by people who want to go back in time to the dark ages of Arab history in order to enforce a way of life that does not cope with modern life. And as you know, terrorism in all its forms and means and consequences, and of course their end game is to bring down the national borders and to strike at the fabric of Arab nations. I want to tell our European friends that you talk about minorities in the Arab world. There are no minorities. Christians, Muslims, Shiites, Sunnis, they are main components of the Arab region, the Amazighs, the same thing. They have not come from across the border. It might be because of their place of birth or family history, whatever. It might be a Shiite or a Sunni or from the Druze, but they belong to the region. They are part of its components, and these components are what have given this region its strength and its vitality and has led civilization at certain times. And unfortunately, today we are going through an evanescence. And are all these uprisings spontaneous? No. We as Arab countries, we have lagged behind in democratic process. Other countries were in the lead. Some of them are Latin American countries, Southern European, even some other countries. And so when we talk about democracy, democracy is not only an agenda or it's a prescription or no. Democracy should emanate from reality, from the components of a nation, also from upbringing, and it should be a gradual process so that this democracy will translate the hopes of every nation and every region. Of course, we had the foundation for this. And also Arab countries and Arab leaders in the Tunisia summit in 2014, allow me to quote. In 2014, the Arab summit in Tunisia, we are the Arab leaders, we declare our insistence on that democracy takes root in our regions and in the political process and in decision making and in the rule of the law and in justice amongst the people and independence of the law in all components of society, including NGOs, and they add to this also freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and freedom of faith. The Arab leaders talked about freedom of faith. You are Christian, you're Muslim, you're Shia. They said that in 2014. And so, but unfortunately, implementation might be the problem why this content did not see fruition. And another point that I want to focus on is that the Arab League, since this summit, started every year to issue a report on the democratic process and change that are taking place in the Arab countries, and they asked every country to come forward with the report. And of course, the Secretary General, of course, we have Mr. Amr Moussa here, who was Secretary General of the Arab League, and he was the one who would come forth with the reports. And of course, what are the aspects of democracy in the Arab world? What are the features? And I say that we have three features. We have the democracy of division or sharing, but of course, this might apply at certain stages, but of course, citizenship should be the umbrella to give citizens the rights. And then, of course, consensus. And of course, consensus amongst the political blocs, like in Iraq. And then, of course, the ballot box. then we have three models, but I believe that the first two models are a prologue that lead to the ballot box. And of course, citizenship remains the main component that guarantees equality among citizens. And Dr. Siraj Eddin yesterday was talking about Western democracy and how it can be developed. And I say, when it comes to the Arab region, democracy is still in the experimental stage, the trial and error stage, and sometimes it goes into retreat until all the components and the causes for going forward are there. And my final point is that this situation has posed 9 challenges before the Arab League. The first is these crises, complicated crises in some Arab countries and how they can be addressed in Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, and Syria. And the second challenge is this stagnancy in the peace process and how it can come to an end, because all of this has to do with democracy and stability in the region. And so this impasse or this stagnancy in the peace process has to be brought to an end, and the Palestinian of course, question has to be resolved. And the third is that those people who want to bring back certain periods of Islamic history and enforce them today in order to put an end to the hopes of youth and to put an end to openness to the world. And the fourth challenge is working on bringing emerging democracies to fruition and opening doors before youth. And the fifth challenge is reviewing the methodology of Arab relations. And the sixth challenge is to ensure an Arab security system when it comes to food security. It's not only about military security, but water security. And of course, we need an Arab safety measures or security measures. And the next challenge is how to bring the Arab League since its inception in 1945 to cope with the modern times. And the other challenge is the nuclear projects in the region that will open the door to a nuclear race unless this is bound by international laws, and also the balance of relations with neighboring countries, whether security-wise, political, and interest-wise. And that's why there should be a dialogue amongst all the neighboring countries here, and the regions outside the Arab region should partake in the success of this dialogue. And finally, I want to say that the General Secretary of the Arab League in the Sharm el-Sheikh summit in 19th of January 2011, he told the Arab leaders, Tunisia had started already with the uprising, and I quote, "I want to point out to the uprisings, social uprisings, that Arab countries are going through. What is happening in Tunisia in a way of revolution is not far removed from this league, and the broken Arab self by causes of poverty and other things that unfortunately we have brought about the outrage of the Arab citizens. Today we are in the 21st century, and the title, of course, comes in one word, is the Renaissance. It is summarized in the word Renaissance, and so are the words of the Secretary General of the Arab League to Arab leaders in 19th of January 2011, and where the uprisings or this earthquake that shook the Arab region, is it going to be a new Arab awakening and bring fresh hopes to realizing the dreams of Arab nations in order to fulfill the democratic hopes of this?
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ben Heli. May I now turn to our friends and colleagues from the Club de Madrid, who are with the Nizami Ganjabi International Center that I have the pleasure of representing, collaborating with us in organizing this event. And so may I call on Mr. Luis Peral, please.
Presidents, Prime Ministers, participants, let me first congratulate the Library of Alexandria and Dr. Sergaldin for having organized this conference. Dr. Sergaldin has always been a guest of honor in Club de Madrid conferences and seminars on democracy, and I'm honored to be your guest now, Dr. Sergaldin. I'm particularly satisfied that there are 10 Club de Madrid members participating in this conference. This shows the commitment of them all and the commitment of the organization to the cause of democracy. It was, in fact, a group of Club de Madrid members who addressed the Secretariat some 3 years ago, asking us to devise a program on the crisis of democracy, to try and create new ideas in order to avoid the crisis in democracy. Of course, the word crisis may sound very strong, but there are sufficient evidence these days. There are studies, there are indicators showing that there are at least signals of decline in democracy. And this affects emerging democracies, transitional democracies, as well as consolidated democracies, that was already said. And this is, in my view, sufficiently important to gather us all here. Democracy is perhaps the most important achievement in human history. So the fact that we are already identifying signals of decline is sufficiently important to really make an effort in trying to avoid it. We cannot democracy decline. We cannot let it decline. Let me briefly try to outline a few challenges I see for democracy. In fact, the title of this conference is very provocative in that sense. The question in front of us is whether the democratic paradigm will be upheld by the younger generations, whether democracy will still be a paradigm in the future. And I believe some big challenges that have already been mentioned, I will not elaborate on them, are, in my view, crucial in order to understand the future of democracy. The first of all is the relationship between the market economy and democratic governance. There is clearly a tension there. Capitalism entails a degree of inequality, and democracy aspires to equality. So this tension has always been present. We don't aspire that democracy creates a world where everybody is equal in economic terms, but clearly there is a balance to be somehow sustained between the two principles. And we can safely say that if inequalities increase, then the market economy is prevailing over the democratic principle. And the other way around, countries that are making effort in mitigating inequalities are making democracy prevail over the tension, over the trend of the market economy. So we need to bear in mind this relationship in order to understand the future of democracy. Also, there is a very, very, in my view, important development in this regard. For decades, democracies had the monopoly of the market economy. But now there are non-democratic countries that have already embraced the market economy. And democracies need to prove better in bringing people out of poverty. Otherwise, new generations will not feel attracted by the democratic paradigm. And there are situations now in which no democratic countries are more efficient in tackling social problems. I believe that this is a challenge to democracies. Democracies need to prove they are better at doing so. Otherwise, the younger generations may lose faith in democracy, and this is something we want to avoid. The second challenge, in my view, that is global and is very important for the future of democracy is that of delivering regarding the climate change and regarding the management of natural resources. I will, of course, not elaborate on it. We are all following closely the developments of the COP21 in Paris. But again, this is important for the future of democracy and for the younger generations, remaining part of the democratic system. Otherwise, particularly in developed countries, but also globally, younger people will feel that their democratic leaders are not fulfilling their aspirations. They are not really able to preserve the environment. And again, here there is a challenge, a specific challenge for democracies. We need to prove that we are doing better than non-democratic states in tackling the consequences of climate change and in mitigating climate change. The third major challenge to democracy I want to outline now has also been very well identified in your program, Dr. Senegal-Ling, is the question of radicalization and violent extremism. But let me put it in a different way. The risk here, or the challenge here, is that responses to terrorism may go against the democratic principle. And that shows the fragility of democracy. Democrats, well, are not well equipped to fight undemocratic challenges. And to the extent that democracy does not respect the basic democratic principles, it will go against itself. And we will lose the capacity then to uphold democratic principles in that situation, meaning, in fact, that violent extremists will prevail in their principles, will prevail in their deeds. I will be participating next Monday in a special session of the Security Council focusing on the responsibility to protect. I will be briefing the Council in this informal session on how the principle of responsibility to protect may be used in facing the challenge of violent extremism. And of course, the core of my proposal would be that the international community, as it responds to the challenge of violent extremism, it should create the conditions for democracy to prevail. Otherwise, the response of the international community will in fact expand violent extremism, will in fact expand extremism and radicalization as a result of international action. Those are, in very general terms, part of the challenges that all democracies are facing. And what is the answer? How can we go about? Club de Madrid is now, with the support of the Library of Alexandria, with the support of the Nizami Ganjavi Center, drafting agendas for democracy that are discussed in different regions in a process that is driven by Club de Madrid members from that region. And it's very important, Ambassador Bengheli, to have that in mind. It's for regional actors to decide what kind of democracy suits better for each region, or even for each sub-region. But it's also important to identify good practices in the region, transformative ideas in the region, so that other countries can really see that there are possibilities for democracy to do better. And this is our ambition now, to draft these agendas for democracy for different regions of the world, to have these agendas being discussed by Club de Madrid members and endorsed by them by the end of next year, and then do advocacy and disseminate those agendas so that democracy is strengthened. To that end, I will be taking notes of the discussions for the next 3 days. I will be incorporating all these discussions into the Next Generation Democracy Project, and I will keep you updated. Thank you very much.
Last but not least in this presentation of welcoming words is our colleague, Mr. Bjorn Berg, from the Council of Europe. I have to say 2 things about the Council of Europe. Although they are not officially co-organizers with us of this event, we have a strong relationship and a strong partnership. And I just called Secretary General Jagland after what happened in Paris to tell him how much I admired his prescience in having selected, 5-6 months ago, to start a major dialogue in Europe on what he termed democratic security, which is how can the European states develop tools to enhance their security and still at the same time respect the democratic values and freedoms of their citizens, how to strike that balance. So he was quite prescient when we see what is happening right now on that. He was also quite prescient in another event in which I had the pleasure and privilege of participating, in which we discussed the role of Muslims and Islam in Europe. Not sort of Muslims and the West, it is about Muslims in the West. And that was another, I think, very important topic. And we are now planning to continue our collaboration in other areas. So I was very, very happy that Mr. Bjorn Berg from the Secretary General's immediate collaborators would join us in our reflections here on this issue, because I think we are all looking at a very profound problem for our times. Mr. Berg, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first let me also thank you, Dr. Serageldin. As you said, you have been recently involved in a very important project with the Council of Europe, and the essence of this project is really to see how we together can address the growing problem of radicalization. I also like to thank the library. It's my first visit to this impressive site, and I cannot help but feel a little proud that it was a Norwegian group of architects, Snøhetta, which designed this beautiful building. And as a matter of fact, later went on to design the museum at Ground Zero in New York and also the new Opera House in Oslo. If the question is, what must we understand about democracy in the 21st century? The answer is what we learned about democracy in the 20th century. Namely, that democracy is unquestionably tied to our security, and that the best way to deliver lasting peace and stability is to build it on democracy, human rights, and rule of law. From a European perspective, this was the means by which we moved on from the utter devastation of 2 world wars in the previous century. As our continent tried to draw a line under the vast atrocities which had taken place, our leaders came together and did something extraordinary. They put national interest to one side in order to agree a new international legal order. They realized, as Churchill said, that where the rule of law ends, tyranny begins, and so established a common legal space to restrain excessive power and protect fundamental rights. In short, They understood that we cannot think solely of our safety in terms of guns, battles, and tanks. We have to think about our democratic security too. The European Convention on Human Rights was born in 1949. With it, the Council of Europe, under which sits the European Court of Human Rights. We have now 47 members, all European countries except Belarus. And it is worth pointing out that the convention has been included since as an explicit safeguard in a number of major peace agreements, including the 1995 Dayton Peace Agreement, the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, and the 2007 Ahtisaari Plan for Kosovo. And yet, we still cannot say that the concept of democratic security has been sufficiently integrated, mainstreamed, or understood. Not in Europe or otherwise. Indeed, at times of pronounced insecurity, democratic principles are frequently downgraded and sidelined, and even seen as an impediment to stability. This is happening right now, all over, in response to the terror threat. As governments try to ensure that security services have the powers they need to protect us, the debate is raging over how much liberty we should give up in the process. But it's a false choice. Everyone will remember the aftermath of September 11th, when, during the hunt for Al-Qaeda, grave human rights abuses were conducted in the name of national security. For example, in Abu Ghraib prison. Rather than make us safer, these actions discredited our democracies and provided a boost to terrorists looking for new recruits. We must not repeat the same mistakes. And if we needed any further proof of the contemporary relevance of democratic security concept, it is all around us. Look no further, for example, than the crisis in Ukraine. The Russian Federation's illegal annexation of Crimea was deeply destabilizing. But Ukraine's problems did not begin or end with that act. Widespread corruption, a lack of independent institutions, and the mismanagement of power weakened the country too. Look no further than the Republic of Moldova, another state marred by corruption and oligarchy and descending into crisis, with serious potential consequences for regional stability. But on a more positive note, look no further than Tunisia, now widely accepted as the most successful of the so-called Arab Spring countries, precisely because it's managed to deliver a new, more inclusive constitution. So, democratic security remains the fundamental principle for the Council of Europe, and we work with our 47 member states to bolster it on 5 fronts, the 5 building blocks of democratic security, which I will run through very quickly. And by the way, these are areas we work with our partners south of the Mediterranean too. 1. Stable states need impartial and independent judiciary, because without them, faith in state authorities plummets and discord invariably follows. Our Secretary General's most recent annual report found widespread judicial weaknesses in over a third of the European countries. We have therefore expedited a pan-European action plan to step up reform in this area. 2, freedom of expression and free media, because it keeps the powerful honest. The same report found that conditions for free media are worsening across the European continent, and in many places the safety of journalists is deteriorating. This is why, for example, we have now recently introduced a new internet-based platform to ring the alarm bell over individual cases and put governments under pressure to respond. 3, influential civil society, because it is one of the most effective checks on state power and an antidote to disillusionment. So we are especially active in ensuring that our members' domestic laws enable rather than restrict freedom of assembly and association, and that we have a political environment in our member countries that promotes rather than impedes the independent voices of civil society. 4, legitimate democratic institutions, because social calm depends on giving voters confidence that, come election day, they can boot out bad governments and have a real political alternatives. Creating these conditions is at the heart of much of our bilateral work with our member states. Finally, and 5th, building inclusive societies, because no amount of laws or institutions can substitute for strong interpersonal, intercommunity relationships based on tolerance and mutual respect. We have a whole range of initiatives, as a matter of fact, in this sphere, but perhaps the most important are those which center on education and teaching young Europeans to understand and embrace Europe's cultural and religious diversity, and to see themselves as democratic citizens. So to sum up, in a sentence, what is democracy about in the 21st century? It is about ensuring the respect for the 5 building blocks of democratic security, which is the best guarantee of sustainable peace and stability. And that is the same in Europe and across the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Berg. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now move to our keynote speakers for this opening session. I regret to inform you that President Obasanjo, who was on his way here, had some difficulties with procedural matters in London, and will be unable to join us today. However, he has informed me that he is sending his paper and that we will print the paper and distribute it to all the participants here. For the second part of this opening session, I'm very pleased and very proud to invite a leader from this region, a leader who has been elected democratically and who left democratically, a leader who continues to fight for democracy in his country and on the Arab scene. Our guest is His Excellency Prime Minister Fouad Siniora of Lebanon. And I would now ask our colleagues from the panel if they would like to take their seats in the audience and invite His Excellency Prime Minister Senora to take the podium. So please thank the panel and welcome Prime Minister Senora.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I actually was not well briefed that it's preferable for my paper to be delivered in English. So I'm going to deliver it in Arabic. And I'm going to address democracy and democratic practices in the Arab world, in many countries in the Arab world, that led actually to what's called the Arab Spring. And I'm going to ultimately suggest a new social and political pact that can be adopted in varying countries, many countries in the Arab world. السيدات والسادة.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I start my speech, I want to comment on something said by Mr. Berg when he said that democracy might not be equipped to overcome terrorism because it has to respect the rule of law and human rights. But it can actually, and it is well equipped to deal with the problems that some might use as an excuse for their terrorist actions. My dear friend, Dr. Ismail Sirajuddin, ladies and gentlemen, it is such an honor to be here today in the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, this great beacon of knowledge and learning that becomes Egypt and that of course, becomes Alexandria, the pearl of the Mediterranean. And it is such an honor to address you today on democracy in the 21st century, because the topic is not only interesting and important, but it is a necessity for Arabs in this precarious period in their history, in order for us to agree on a new political and social pact, which I will be presenting in my paper. The vision that Dr. Sirajuddin presented to us in the program paper when he talked about the pessimistic state in the Arab region, and I will not claim that it is more optimistic because we have a bleak reality and it is a time of difficult labor. This time we are going through as Arabs, nations and countries and societies. Truth is the turbulence that is growing and that has caused these crises are known to the most of us, and they have taken place and they are still taking place, and we are trying to bring to an end this instability which started in 2011 in the Arab world. And this surge, this wave might have met a dead end for reasons we know, but it will be followed by a second and third surge if we do not pay attention to the necessity to listen to these demands and to try to cope with the changes in order to work on bringing to an end such instability. We must know the reasons. The Arab nations that want to cope with the modern world was not really fortunate during the 20th century. For after the fall of the Ottoman Empire came colonialism, and of course it was the hopes of the leaders and the nations to get rid of this colonization, and of course there were institutions that emerged in order to guarantee this. And then during the Second World War came more difficult conditions that unfortunately aborted many of the promising movements. And this, of course, culminated in the colonization of Palestine, or the occupation of Palestine by the Israelis, and many nations wanted to bring back their land and to restore the dignity of persons and to ensure social and economic progress, and to be on the neutral front when during many processes. But unfortunately we did not restore the land, but we lost more lands, and dignity was not restored in all its forms. For a number of our countries were subjected to setbacks and coups and conflicts and sectarian strifes and more violent events, and that's why many of our capacities and opportunities were laid aside because of the mismanagement and abuse of power. And we also lost our representative governments, and the constitutions that guaranteed personal rights were aborted, and the marginalization of people took place, and also the deterioration of the standards of living. And this, of course, resulted in deterioration in all humanistic aspects and social aspects, as well as participation in public life. As for some oil countries, of course, there was this flourishing that we cannot consider an developmental progress, but some of them were a screen behind which many of the errors were hidden, and the inability for sustainable development and to decrease their dependence on oil, which of course have posed many threats for these regimes. For many decades in the Arab region, there were attempts that weren't all successful in order to realize the promises, and that's why preserving security in these countries came before personal freedoms and participation and a sustainable economic growth and on development. And also they attempted to control the economy, but this was, of course, or this depended on the will of the decision makers, and also improving the standards of living for citizens, and to progress in the field of education that copes with the scientific discoveries and the labor market, and also to improve healthcare and to find or to present job opportunities to the many young people in the labor market. But unfortunately you find the absence of freedoms and absence of real political parties, and the vitality of civil society and the political street was absent in favor of suppression of freedoms and participation at a time when many countries abroad were going through important changes. The reality of this is that across the previous decades, when many of our Arab countries were subjected to the oppression of the Israeli occupation, and before that, the Western colonization, there was a political and social pact in many Arab countries came as a reality, because forcing is not really a pact. Of course, this had to be done in parallel with dictatorships staying in power for many decades to ensure stability and security, in spite of the fact that this, of course, was at the expense of democracy and freedoms. And of course, these regimes said that the stability of the macroeconomic level, but unfortunately, this was again at the expense of structural reforms that were needed by Arab countries in order to guarantee better performance, economic, social, and regional. And also, this did not go hand in hand with the adequate structural reforms that were needed in order to improve governance and management, and to bolster the culture of productivity and transparency and participation and combating corruption. And in these countries, the growth levels that were needed in order to face the overpopulation problem in many of these countries, and so the need for job opportunities for millions of young people who needed and looked forward to being part of the labor market over the 3 past decades. And also there was an increase in an employment rate, and with it came widespread corruption, and of course these resulted in pessimism and frustration, and this was on the large scale in these countries. And this increase in unemployment, in particular amongst youth, coincided with the lack of effective initiatives in order to find a solution for the increasing problems, and also to cope with the technological revolution and the communication, especially when it comes to social networks, which were the tool and the main incentive behind the uprisings and sometimes turbulence in the Arab region. A large portion of these youth realized that the price of tenuous stability, both on the security and economic level, was high, and of course came at the expense of freedoms, equality, and dignity in all its forms. And they realized also that this tenuous stability has not really led to the translation of what was achieved on the macroeconomic level to improve the economic sectors in each country. And so this has not led to a leap in providing job opportunities and improving the standard of level and decreasing exclusion and marginalization. Many of these regimes, they had hoped that this economic stability will lead to encouraging investment in projects that will bolster economic in the economic process, and of course provide job opportunities for youth. But the reality is that this investment remained on a low scale, especially in the essential sectors or the basic sectors, because on the level of government and management, there was incompetency, and it did not really work towards bolstering productivity and facilitating procedures of businesses and reforming legislation to protect investment and to make it more effective, or to bolster transparency and decrease the levels of corruption, or to combat corruption and improve education and of course train the youth for the needed skills. And these were all reforms that were not really addressed, and in many cases they had to do with the established interests amongst big corporations that had a close relation with the existing regimes. And so this tenuous macroeconomic growth, of course, it was in the interest of the existing regimes, and it encouraged nepotism, and with their relatives they formed a stratum of society that was incredibly wealthy, and this of course increased the gap between them and the other strata. And also the negative effect of this growing gap, of course, was made worse by the gradual disappearance of a middle class that might have become or ensured instability. And of course, these practices presented an obstacle to competition, and that's why this led to the formation of cartels that affected negatively competitiveness and productivity, and this of course stopped the growth of agricultural and industrial sectors in society that could have provided job opportunities. And this of course stopped, or also it posed an obstacle to benefiting from skills and improvement that would be brought about by reforming education in order to cope with the needs and requirements of these emerging economies. And the initiative of a vendor, a vegetable vendor, who set fire to himself in Tunisia, signaled the end of this social and political pact that existed in the 3 previous decades. And of course, the movements of the Arab Spring came as an expression of the refusal or the rejection of Arab nations to this bitter reality, and their desire to have a new political and social pact, and other than the one on which many Arab regimes were based. And that's how the Arab region was ushered into a turbulent time, which led sometimes to the militarization of these movements through excessive violence, which of course brought about a chaotic situation that resembled war zones in some Arab countries, and stability on the political and security and economic fronts vanished without leading to any benefits on the social or economic fronts. growth from 2011 to 2015 decreased from 5% before the Arab Spring to 2.5%, and the deficit in the commercial scale became 15% or more. And it used to be 5%, and also inflation increased from 5 or jumped from 5 to 10%, and of course this has affected negatively many of the national currencies and also affected the purchasing power of the underprivileged and the poorer classes. Ladies and gentlemen, this all went hand in hand with macro-scale changes in the scene, general scene, and of course many extremists resorted to terrorism that were brought about by some regimes. And before that, the accumulation of social and political problems over a number of decades, and that have remained without permanent solutions, which contributed to the increase in people's pessimism and frustration, especially amongst youth, and also such setbacks led to negative effects when it came to these problems, especially that the Palestinian question has not yet been resolved, and also foreign and regional interventions in Arab countries has led to groups to be closed on themselves, which were resorted to justify rejecting the other. And of course this was brought about by a sick a way of thinking that started in Afghanistan, and then of course it grew in the shadow of these regimes, and these ways of thinking were fed by modes of education that did not really give a full understanding of the peaceful teachings of Islam. And of course some people gave themselves the right to search the deeds and decisions of people, and so some people resorted to violence that of course was in isolation from any kind of religious teaching. And that's how the Arab region has gone through a precarious time, and many of these countries lost security without gaining on the freedoms, on the liberties front, and they lost political and economic stability without really gaining on the institutional front, and extremism and resorting to terrorism replaced reasoning and using one's mind and being open to tolerance. And our nations have gone over the past 5 years through very harsh lessons because our youth wanted change, and they still want it. But the events of the past years, unfortunately, has brought about the many fears, and many people who desire change were marginalized. And of course this has led to the collapse of the state in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Somalia. And as a result of such clashes, the Arab nations have many fears, because first of all the demands for change have been turned against those who demanded them, and of course the collapse of state does not leave any alternatives for people, and it might lead to despair that might eventually lead to extremism and resort to terrorism and violence. And that's why politicians and intellectuals and active agents on the political front should bear into consideration these two aspects when they plan for the future. Because it is not right to remain hostages to the current situation, which is deteriorating, and we must have a positive change through new ways of thinking and through practices that would put us on the path to resolving all these crises and lead us to a better future that would open prospects for these youth that unfortunately have been disappointed by all the setbacks of the past years. Ladies and gentlemen, first, when it comes to countering extremist movements, it has become a must that we must save Islam and restore it from those who want to kidnap it or abduct it. And also we should stop Arab countries from falling in the whirlpool of ethnic and religious clashes, and that's why we must counter extremist movements, and we must find ways for religious reform and designing programs for reforming religious education that we offer to our children. And also this kind of reform has to be directed at clerics and who must be part of this reform process, and they must preach tolerance and respecting other human rights and personal freedoms. There is a need to encourage critical thinking in our nations in order to change the way they perceive the world. After decades, when after the hegemony of militaristic institutions over government and religious institutions, and so Islamic reform must be through re-evaluating the importance of learning and science, and to respect human rights, and to be open to the world, and to advocate the fraternity of humankind and all the similarities amongst the different nations around the world. As for the building process, I start by saying that there must be a consensus for a new political and social contract that is adopted by elected governments with the help of youth, or with the participation of youth, because it has become very clear that it is useless to resort to violence from any of the involved parties, because violence leads to more destruction and the loss of more opportunities. This is a partnership that is based on a pact, as Ibn Khaldun says, that it is a renovation of a heritage that had harmony and interdependence. It is the building of the individual, and the building the group, where people who believe in real reform would be produced out of this process, and they would hold people accountable based on their performance as per democratic tenets. And this situation will not change until this new pact is drafted, which indicates what a person, the individual, would sacrifice in return for benefits. And the main elements or features of this pact are the following. First, ensuring or renewing our faith in the Arab heritage and the Arab history and civilization and harmony amongst these nations. It shouldn't be a political project, because the recession of the idea of pan-Arabism or Arabism and the belief of the Arab nations in this over the past decades has led to the emergence of many problems that have encouraged division based on identities and ethnicities and denominations, and this of course has led to many clashes and erroneous practices. The enlightened understanding of Arabism is that it brings all the Arabs together, and it encourages moderation and openness and dialogue and tolerance and freedom and democracy. It is Arabism that respects plurality without really undermining the sovereignty of countries, and that rejects violence and inquisition. And it is an Arabism that believes in the civil state, that admits or the equality of all citizens, and that of course does not really distinguish or divide people based on their religions or ethnicity. And the only choice left for our countries cannot be choosing between totalitarian regimes and religious regimes. On the other hand, our bitter experience over the past decades was that we had to choose between totalitarianism and extremism, and they are two faces of the same coin. It has become clear, and it is also necessary to take this coin from currency. And despite all the setbacks of the Arab Spring, Arab nations, and in particular Arab youth, they look forward to modern civil societies that are moderate and far removed from totalitarianism and extremism. The civil state that does not really marginalize any citizens is the one that encourages the plurality of religions. It is not militaristic and it is not religious, because the civil state is the first article in this new pact, and also ensuring that personal freedoms and group freedoms are guaranteed by constitution, and of course given that it is really enforced. Totalitarian regimes and their militaristic institutions are still posing a threat to minorities, and they claim that they are better equipped to protect them, which of course has proven to be a failure, because if those who lack something cannot really offer it, and they do not believe in plurality or participation or personal freedoms or public freedoms, and so they cannot really offer freedom to groups, whether they are the majority or the minority. The same thing goes the resorting to the coalition of minorities to protect them is a recipe for igniting clashes and wars that will not end and that will not lead to any solution, but they will lead to existential dangers, especially when it comes to the minorities. Plurality is one of the best features of the East, and it is a blessing, and it must be an enriching factor in our Arab nations. Unfortunately, some Arab regimes has turned this blessing into an evil feature and or something detested, and that's why in the new pact we should honor all the components of Arab countries and with the participation of the citizens of these nations. And this pact, of course, will respect the unity of the region and will guarantee that there are institutions that respect the constitution and the laws. And fourth, we must go through institutional reform, and this is through encouraging institutional thinking and working on building institutions and bolstering their ability to do their job in harmony, and also to guarantee their ability to for checks and balances within the system, for a constitution that respects the freedoms of groups and individuals, and property is one of the pillars of a new civil state that copes with the rest of the world, but it is not enough on its own if it does not go hand in hand with effective institutions that guarantee its enforcement for reform. And we have an experiences that lead to what I just said, that we need this pact for economic and social betterment, and of course there must be representative councils for legislation, or houses of representatives for the legislation and control, and also there must be administrative reform, and there must be efforts exerted in order to bolster the infrastructure of these countries and their economies, and which will work as development plans like the Marcha project in the context of the policy for integration in the Arab region, and that would bear in mind Arab interests and of course guaranteeing Arab security, national security, and which will cause of course a leap forward in water security and in transportation and basic services. And also there should be judicial and legislative institutions that are independent and effective, that guarantee duties and responsibilities, and of course must guarantee the flow of investments in order to achieve sustainable development and provide better job opportunities. And fifth and last point is that we must assert that a macroeconomic level must be independent. For the experience in many countries, as we have already mentioned, that economic stability, though it is very important, it is not able on its own if it does not cope with structural and institutional reform that incite or encourage development and economic growth, and to decrease the problems of unemployment that we have in the Arab world. It should address monopoly, and it should bolster the different aspects of economy in a way that encourages competitiveness and development. These 5 pillars, which are enlightened Arabism, civil state, and protecting the rights of individuals and groups, that should be stipulated in constitution, and effective institutions, and the legislative reforms that go hand in hand with institutional reform, are what constitute a new political and social pact that will fulfill the hopes of our Arab nations, and that will guarantee equality and dignity to Arab nations. And that's why any established authority or future authority must have a roadmap that will draft this pact, which will bring back hope in the future, especially amongst youth, and also to bolster the trust between the youth and governments. And only then it will be possible to ask these nations that have suffered a lot till now to offer more sacrifices. But of course, these components on the short term and medium term will fulfill all the reforms on the economic and political scale. Ladies and gentlemen, they have been trying years. We, of course, with the terrorism and the displacement of hundreds of millions, by the way, the UN says that the number of refugees around the world is around 60 million. Number of refugees in the Arab world is 30 million, which means 50% of the number of refugees around the world. Given that we have in the Arab region, we have 6% of the total world population. There is no international or regional body over these years that has not intervened in our countries. But we have to admit, what are the 5 or 10 years in the lives of nations? We are an ancient and great region with ancient civilizations, and we can spring back up, and of course success can come out of the womb of the crises and the failures that we have brought upon themselves, and of course brilliance can come out of pitch black darkness, and we can achieve much as an Arab world. Ladies and gentlemen, it was such an honor to speak to you today about democracy and the way I see how it can be practiced in the 21st century in the Arab world, in the light of all the bitter experiences that the Arab region has gone through for many decades, and the practices that they have gone through. And I hope that we will see different practices in the future, and this cannot happen unless there are new political and social pacts drafted in the different Arab countries that guarantee stability and that bolster economic and social growth, which will restore the dignity and flourishing in these countries. I hope I did not give you a long speech, but I hope that we will be thinking about the things I mentioned in my paper, and I thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for this very impassioned and profound speech. And we have just asked His Excellency for a copy of the text, which will be printed and distributed to the participants, as will the speech of Mr. Obasanjo, who could not join us and is sending his paper to be added later on. So, colleagues, we now have a brief moment, about 15-20 minutes for a coffee break. Coffee is outside, and then we shall resume with the first panel dealing with framing the issues. Thank you each and everyone for your participation, and we look forward to reassemble here at 12:30.